When you think about human history, what comes to mind? The pyramids of Giza? The Great Wall? Maybe the first cities of Mesopotamia? If you open a standard history textbook, or even if you just browse popular science articles online, you'll often run into a very specific number: 60,000 years. There is a pervasive idea out there that the human story, the real story, started roughly 60,000 years ago. You'll hear that this is when we became human, or when we finally left Africa to conquer the globe. But here's the problem. That number, it's not just slightly off. It's missing about 80% of the story. What if I told you that the 60,000-year timeline isn't the beginning of our existence, but actually a much later chapter? What if I told you that anatomically modern humans, people who look just like you and me, have been walking this earth for closer to 300,000 years? Today, we are going to dive deep into a comprehensive analysis of paleontological, archaeological, and genetic evidence to set the record straight. We're going to look at fossils found in Morocco that rewrote the textbooks. We're going to look at evidence of complex tool-making and artistic expression that predates the Upper Paleolithic Revolution by tens of thousands of years. The truth is, human history didn't begin with writing or cities or even that big migration out of Africa. It began hundreds of millennia earlier. So buckle up. We are about to reclaim 240,000 missing years of human history. Before we start digging up bones, we have to answer a fundamental question. What do we actually mean when we say human? This simple semantic issue is actually the root of all the confusion. You see, scientists and historians often conflate different milestones. There are really 4 different starting lines, and people keep mixing them up. First, you have the emergence of anatomically modern humans. That's the hardware. Skeletons with rounded skulls, flat faces, and chins, basically us. Second, you have behavioral modernity. That's the software. Symbolic thought, art, language, complex planning. Third, there's the dispersal. That's the moment populations moved out of Africa to populate Eurasia. And finally, way down the line, you have civilization, agriculture, and writing. Here is where the mistake happens. The popular 60,000-year figure, that refers specifically to the major dispersal event. That's when a wave of successful populations migrated from Africa into Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas. This was a huge moment. It was a critical expansion. But, and this is crucial, it emphatically does not mark the beginning of human existence. To say human history starts at 60,000 years is like saying your life story began the day you moved out of your parents' house. Sure, it's a big milestone, but you were alive, learning, and growing for years before you packed that moving truck. Contemporary paleoanthropology proves that our childhood as a species took place in Africa, and it lasted a very, very long time. Let's look at the hard evidence. For a long time, we thought East Africa was the sole cradle of humanity, and the clock started around 200,000 years ago. But in 2017, everything changed. Excavations at Jebel Irhoud in northwestern Morocco uncovered skeletal remains of at least 5 individuals. Using thermoluminescence dating on the flint tools found with them, scientists dated these bones to approximately 300,000 years ago. Look at this skull. It's a mosaic. The face? It has reduced brow ridges and a vertical profile. It looks like a modern human. But the brain case is still a bit elongated, more like earlier ancestors. This tells us something incredible. We didn't just pop into existence fully formed. Modern human anatomy evolved gradually. But the facial features, the part of us that we recognize in the mirror, were already there 300,000 years ago. And it wasn't just Morocco. Let's head over to Ethiopia, to the Homo Formation. Here, researchers found fossils originally dated to 195,000 years ago. But recent reanalysis suggests they might be even older, potentially over 230,000 years old. The Homo skull has a rounded brain case and a chin. It is undeniably us. Then goes south to Forestbad, South Africa. A skull fragment there dates to 260,000 years ago. Do you see the pattern? By 300,000 years ago, early modern humans weren't just in one Garden of Eden. They were dispersed across the entire African continent, from Morocco to Ethiopia to South Africa. This completely contradicts the old model of a sudden, recent origin. We have been here, physically, for a third of a million years. Okay, so we looked human 300,000 years ago. But were we acting human? Or were we just walking mannequins waiting for a software update? For a long time, anthropologists believed in something called the Great Leap Forward. They thought that around 40,000 years ago in Europe, humans suddenly became smart, inventing art and complex tools overnight. This was, well, frankly, it was a Eurocentric bias. When we actually looked at the African archaeological record, specifically the Middle Stone Age, we found that behavioral modernity didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn. The Middle Stone Age, or MSA, ran from about 280,000 to 50,000 years ago, and it wasn't primitive. We see evidence of hafting, that's attaching stone points to wooden handles to make spears or axes. That requires planning. It requires engineering. Let's look at Sabudu Rock Shelter in South Africa. Digging into layers from 77,000 years ago, archaeologists found something amazing: bedding, but not just a pile of grass. These early humans constructed mats using sedges and leaves that contained natural insecticidal chemicals. They were repelling mosquitoes. 77,000 years ago, they understood the medicinal properties of plants and used them to improve their quality of life. And then there's art. We used to think cave paintings in Europe were the start of art. But in Africa, we find evidence of pigment use, processing red ochre, going back over 100,000 years. At multiple sites, we find engravings, patterns scratched intentionally into rock and shell, dating back 75,000 years or more. This is behavioral modernity, symbolic thought, abstract reasoning, the ability to say this red powder means something. It didn't appear suddenly 40,000 years ago. It developed gradually, over tens of thousands of years, long before we ever wrote down a single word. Now, let's bring in the third witness, genetics. In the 1980s, scientists started using molecular clocks. Specifically, they looked at mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down only from mothers. They found that all living humans share a common maternal ancestor who lived in Africa roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. They called her Mitochondrial Eve. This genetic dating aligns remarkably well with the fossil evidence from Homo kaibish. It confirms that by that time, we were already a distinct population. But wait, if we've been around so long, why does the genetic data also show a massive bottleneck around 60,000 years ago? This brings us back to the source of the confusion. Y chromosome analysis shows that all non-African populations, Europeans, Asians, Indigenous Americans, trace their ancestry to a group that left Africa around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. This is the out-of-Africa event. Imagine a massive family living in a huge house for years. Then, one day, a small group of cousins decides to leave and explore the neighborhood. If you only study the history of the cousins who left, you might think the family history started the day they walked out the door. But the family in the house had been there for generations. That's what happened with the 60,000-year figure. It marks the expansion, not the origin. It's also important to note that this wasn't necessarily the first time humans tried to leave. There is evidence of early humans in Israel and the Arabian Peninsula much earlier. But the 60,000-year wave was the one that stuck, the one that populated the rest of the world. So what happened 60,000 years ago to trigger this massive move? It was likely a mix of things. Climate reconstructions show lower sea levels, which opened up coastal routes. The Arabian Peninsula, often a desert, had wetter, habitable windows. Plus, by this time, humans had sophisticated tools and social structures. We were ready. But when we stepped out of Africa, we weren't entering an empty world. We met others. For most of history, we shared this planet. In Europe and Western Asia, there were Neanderthals. In Asia, there were Denisovans. Genetic evidence proves we didn't just replace them, we interacted with them. We interbred. But between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, those archaic species vanished. We became the sole survivors. This migration required incredible bravery and cognitive skill. Think about the colonization of Australia. Humans reached Australia about 45,000 to 50,000 years ago. To get there, they had to cross the open ocean. That implies maritime technology, navigation, and group planning. You don't build a boat by accident. This brings us to the final, and perhaps most important, realization. We often equate history with written history. We think things only count once we started writing them down in Sumer or Egypt about 5,000 years ago. But look at this timeline. Written civilization is this tiny red sliver at the very end. The agricultural revolution is just a slightly larger sliver before that. For the vast majority of our existence, before agriculture, before writing, we were hunter-gatherers. But we weren't simple. These pre-literate societies had extensive trade networks. They had complex astronomical knowledge. They had rich oral traditions and social hierarchies. To say history began 5,000 years ago, or even 60,000 years ago, insults the hundreds of thousands of generations of innovators who came before. They tamed fire. They figured out which plants healed and which killed. They created the first art. They developed the language we speak today. They survived ice ages and supervolcanoes. So, does humanity have a 60,000-year history? No. That 60,000-year mark is just the moment we packed our bags and went global. The real story extends at least 300,000 years into the past. It is a story rooted deeply in Africa, characterized by a slow, grinding, magnificent accumulation of knowledge, culture, and biological refinement. Understanding this timeline matters. It matters because it reminds us that progress isn't just about skyscrapers and the internet. It reminds us that our shared humanity, our biological unity, was established long before we scattered across the continents. We are an old species. We are survivors. And we have been modern for a lot longer than we give ourselves credit for. I want to know what you think. Does knowing that we've been around for 300,000 years change how you view our current moment in history? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into our origins, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content that challenges what you think you know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.